Assalamu alaikum. You're listening to Unity FM on 93.5. This is the Friday Drive Show, and I'm talking to Dr. Chris Allen, Associate Professor at University of Leicester, about his new book titled Reconfiguring Islamophobia, a radical rethinking of a contested concept. The book tries to better understand why politicians and the public more generally still don't take Islamophobia seriously. And Dr. Chris, I want to ask you about how politics or politicians, especially around election time, for their own votes or popularity, they tend to influence Islamophobia in a negative way.
Yeah. I mean, what was interesting for me was doing, over this decade, I think we've had 3 general elections and we've had the Brexit referendum as well. And one of the things that kind of became evident for me around these kind of periods was the way in which the kind of discussions that were taking place in the kind of public and political and media spaces can be seen to influence the kind of verbal abuse and the hatred which is directed at ordinary Muslims. And so, I think one of the things that we knew was that when there was, say, a terror attack, which was, perpetrated by someone who claimed to be acting, on behalf of the religion of Islam, for example.
All nearly 2 billion of them.
Yeah. We saw that, there was a sharp increase, in the kind of level of hate crime, this kind of idea that, people feel the need to take revenge against ordinary Muslims, have no connection whatsoever with these attacks. It's just the way in which they're linked. But one of the things that we saw was that when, say, there was the attack by Darren Osborne on the Finsbury Park Mosque, for example, when Darren Osborne drove a van into there. What was really interesting was the way in which that is presented as being, kind of just terrorism. When somebody, does something like, say, on Westminster Bridge, for example, it's Islamic terrorism or it's a Muslim terrorist, And so there's the stressing of this idea that actually it's Muslim, So it's always about problematizing, about kind of associating negative stereotypes and negative ideas with Muslims. And this is one of the things you see is that it begins to then seep through. And so, a lot of the Muslim men that I spoke to, they would be referred to as terrorists. They would be referred to as, like Islamists or extremists. The kind of language that we see in the political spaces being used in the kind of the kind of hate spaces. And I think where there was, like, for me, there was a change in what I saw was after the murder of Lee Rigby. There was Muslim men just walking down the street being called soldier killer. There was things about, kind of, you murdered, our soldiers, you murdered a soldier, you're killing the British. This idea, again, attributing it to everybody, all Muslims without differentiation. But it was so interesting the way in which this kind of, it changed and became dynamic and took on the flavour of what was going on in the kind of political spaces. And I think that one of the things for me that was interesting was that when we look at the far right, you could see as well that some of the messages that the far right were using have now become normalised in the mainstream. And, so one of the things I spoke about a few years ago was what I called halal hysteria. This idea that, people were going into supermarkets and they were buying food and, they weren't being told if something was halal or not. And I think it was interesting that just in the past few weeks, we've seen Warburton's bread being, halal certified. This is not anything that's been halal slaughtered. This is just that, it's halal certified, and then you get people saying, well, I'm not eating that bread anymore. It's like, well, I think you'll find that water's halal as well. I think the air we breathe is probably halal as well, but this idea that actually sort of, these kind of things is that part of a wider agenda that Muslims are trying to take over, that Muslims are kind of like, instead of kind of like, just this is actually just something what it is. Bread, pretty much has always been halal, and pretty much all bread is halal. But actually this idea that now just because it's being certified and it puts a little logo on there, that suddenly this is part of this kind of idea of creeping Sharia, which is something which the far right has been using, online in some of its campaigns. This idea that Muslims are creeping into our lives and imposing their Sharia, and so this was something that was really apparent, across that kind of 10-year period. Was the way in which this idea kind of like of something which is said in the public space or political space then becomes normalised. And it was interesting, it was right just before I wrote the book, I started writing the book, it was when Boris Johnson said about Muslim women wear the niqab, looking like letterboxes. And I was actually talking to a friend of mine who happened to be Muslim, and I was talking about writing the book, and he said to me, he said, he said, you heard about the incident last week. This was like literally a week after Boris Johnson had said this. And a Muslim woman wearing the niqab was walking down the street in Birmingham, and somebody who worked for Birmingham City Council shouted across, "Oi, letterbox, go back to where you belong." And it was interesting to see how quick that becomes something which people pick up on. And one of the ways you can kind of explain this is by the way in which politicians and kind of public figures give us permission. So if you've got a prime minister that says, "Oh, it's okay to call a Muslim woman this," then how can you say to somebody in the street, that's disrespectful? Because the first thing they do is turn around and say, "Well, our prime minister said it, so why can't I?" And I think this is what we've seen in America with Trump, is that if Trump says that, Mexicans are rapists, drug dealers, smugglers, illegal immigrants, then actually, how can we say to other people, well, you can't say that? Because actually, if your leaders are doing that, then actually it becomes a real problem, because it then begins to seep through into the public spaces. So that's been something which has been interesting as well, the way in which sort of the things which occur in the kind of political spaces, then begin to shape how people kind of, what they say and how they view Muslims.
You talked about politicians, mainstreaming thing.
Yeah.
We had, in the run-up to the election, some of the political parties pandering to the far right,
absolutely,
to increase their vote. We even had the far right, BNP, EDL, etc., Britain First.
Yeah.
Apparently 5,000 members of theirs joined the Conservative Tory party. With a massive majority now, the Conservative Party being in power, Boris Johnson being in power, are you concerned about where this new power might go?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you look at some of the conservative former parliamentarians that were conservative, people like Dominic Grieve, for example, they've publicly spoken about this kind of lurch to the right, amongst the kind of amongst the Conservative Party, and as you say, the kind of majority gives power. I think that this is something that you can look at very easily. If we look back maybe 10, 15 years ago, and we look at some of the things that the far right are saying, actually this is now pretty much mainstream politicians. I mean, if we look back to the Brexit referendum, this whole idea about who does belong and who doesn't belong, who can belong and who can't belong, actually, is very much, it's a very dangerous and a very divisive kind of form of language. And again, from the research I did, it was interesting because, again, I was speaking to somebody and they said that the day after the referendum, they went to their doctor's surgery, and they were visibly Muslim, and they were standing there. They spoke to the receptionist to say that they were there for their appointment. There was a very elderly lady who was there, and she turned and she said, and as I say, this was the day after the referendum, she said, "Well, finally, you can go back to where you belong." Yeah, and this idea that's how quick it kind of feeds in, it becomes the norm. And of course, this person who, she said to me, "Well, I was born here, my parents were born here, where do I go? Because I don't have anywhere to go." And so again, that the identity crisis I was talking about previously kind of kicks in. And I think that this is one of the things. I mean, you have people like and we've speaking about Saeed Avarsi in the first part. I think that shortly after the election, when Saeed Avarsi on Twitter said about we need to address the Islamophobia that's in our own party. You know, this Syed Avasi, like you say, has been a member of the Conservative Party for 20 years. You know, and I think that Katie Hopkins replied, and she said, "It's not your party anymore; it's our party." And and if you look at the kind of the audience that someone like Katie Hopkins attracts, it is in that kind of far right space. She has become a champion of those kind of ideas. I describe her as a celebrity extremist. I do think she is a far right extremist. And some of the things she says are very, very dangerous, and some of the ideas she puts out there. And I think that this is the thing, and I think that it was funny because when the first book was published in 2010, and for about 2 years, I felt things were getting better, and people would say to me like, "Oh, what do you see as the future? Where do you?" And I'd be like, "Actually, I think we're getting there. I think we're understanding it." Now, 10 years on, and I think that with the political climate of Brexit, I think with the
stagnation of the economy,
the stagnation of the economy, the kind of the growing levels of deprivation, the kind of the gap between the rich and the poor becoming more, bigger, plus the kind of the government that we have and the kind of lurch towards the right. I'm very, very worried, and I think that, I'm probably, hopefully I'm overly pessimistic, but I think that things aren't going to improve for a while. And given that in this period where, we haven't seen any kind of headway made in terms of addressing Islamophobia, I don't see that the current government that we've got is going to prioritise this in any way whatsoever. And so,
especially with that massive majority.
Yeah. It's not, they don't need to win votes, and how many votes are they going to win by addressing Islamophobia, and on a very cynical and mercenary level. I think that's one of the things that we're looking at.
I mean, what do you think the Muslim community, because the onus is on the Muslim community really now, is to stand up and be counted, really.
Absolutely, yeah.
What do you think? Is there some things that they can do? I know generally the Muslim community has that stiff upper lip and get on with things, and people can tend to be a bit apathetic. They're not ready to complain. They're not ready to stand up for their rights. Is there anything that you can advise?
Yeah, I mean, just on that point, I mean, in a way, it's understandable. I've worked with a lot of good people, got good individuals and good organisations, that have been campaigning on so many of these issues, and where have we got? We've got nowhere, and it's very easy to kind of go, well, we're never going to get anywhere, and you can see why the apathy sits in, and again, going back to the kind of people I spoke to, so many people would say, well, there's nothing I can do about this. There's nothing at all you can do. I think that there's a couple of things that we have to do is that, those of us who are, who believe in these issues and are passionate about, kind of addressing this and tackling this, and about kind of, as far as possible, kind of breaking these kind of divisions that are constructed, falsely constructed between whoever we are, between different communities and so on. I think we have to make sure that we work together. I think we have to support each other, and we have to kind of make sure that we direct our, kind of frustration and anxiety at the right people, not at each other. Because a lot of the times, I've seen a lot of Muslim organisations, turning on each other and, blaming each other for things that actually none of them really have caused. So I think that there's a message there in terms of people working together. I think that there is a need to hold people to account. I think that, when we see things like Boris Johnson calling Muslim women letterboxes and niqabs, not accepting that it was a joke, not accepting that, it was a bit of a, it was a gaffe on his part. If any of your listeners have ever written for a newspaper, that you write that, it goes to an editorial team, they edit it, then it goes to the editor. This goes through processes. It's very difficult to get an inaccuracy or something wrong into a published article that isn't meant to be. And this is, from my own experience, this is something I know. So we need to hold people to account. We need to push back on this. We need to be able to speak out. And I think that one of the issues for Muslim communities in particular is that when Muslim communities and voices from in that have spoken out, there's always been this fear that they're going to be tarnished as troublemakers, that it's going to feed into these stereotypes. You're troublemakers, you're extremists, you're angry, and so on. And I think that that's one of the things. I think when we do speak out, we have to speak out in a balanced and objective way. And we have to call people to account in that same balanced and objective way. And we have to do that in a way where we present evidence, where we actually kind of say it how it is, and we actually keep on pushing with that. You know, someone like Saeed Avasi, you know, has been fantastic with that. Again, you know, how far forward we move, I don't know. But, you know, that's some of the stuff that we need to do. And look at those alliances. Where can we make alliances? Because in the political landscape we are at the moment, you know, we need to stand together as much as we possibly can.
Just remind us where people can actually access your book, Reconfiguring Islamophobia.
Yes, so you can access my website, which is www.drchrisallen.uk. You'll be able to kind of look on there, and you'll be able to kind of see some links and everything to there. You can also search on the publisher's website, which is Palgrave. So you can put in Chris Allen Reconfiguring Islamophobia, and you'll be able to see that there. It's also available on Amazon and those kind of places.
It's widely available.
Yeah, it's available everywhere. If anybody has any problems, they can get in touch with me. I'm on social media. I always say I'm very easy to find. The far right find me very quickly and tell me where I'm going wrong. But on Twitter you can find me at Dr. Chris Allen. So Dr. Dr. Chris Allen, all one word.
Okay, we're going to come back to your conclusion in the book shortly, but I just want to involve somebody else in the discussion. Dr. Chris, you mentioned earlier sometimes when Trump speaks in America, you know, it actually reinforces racism, Islamophobia. Increasingly, the world is a global village, you know, through the internet, through TV, media, etc. A lot of what Trump says takes hold even on the streets of the UK and in Europe, and sometimes he definitely goes out of his way to reach out to people. I just want to move to my next guest. He's a native of Canada, a place called Saskatoon, which is in the middle of Canada, which I'd never heard of. His name is Dr. Adam Robit. He's here in the UK. I believe he's settled here for now, for the foreseeable future.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Adam. And what's your sort of take on, obviously you come from Islamophobia. You come from a small town, don't you? About 300,000 people.
I wouldn't call it a small town, but maybe by UK standards, by Birmingham standards, it might be. Yeah.
So, I mean, have you experienced Islamophobia there?
Yes. So Canadians are polite on the surface, you know. So the same goes.
They're descendants of the British, some of them, I think, because we have the same.
So Islamophobia it's not really like, you know, it's not as obvious as you might be in the States or in some other areas, but in my city it's like it's more it's more subtle. It's, you know, a look in the eye of, you know, the person that's supposed to be servicing you or something like that, or just like, you know, that glint of mistrust that you wouldn't recognize it unless you actually had it happen to you. So I can't really speak to when 9/11 happened, and that was fresh and the wound was fresh. It was a little bit more pronounced. You felt this kind of like this I don't know, this thickness in the air that, you know, you could tell that there was, you know, it was more factionalized. You know, you were different. But that kind of subsided as time passed, and then it got back to its baseline, subtle Islamophobia. And the baseline itself, it varies from time to time. You guys mentioned, you know, the global village and Trump affecting things and stuff like that, and I'd have to agree. I think that's special just for the U.S. Because it's like, you know, the U.S. is so prominent and it's very
influential, isn't it?
Yeah, people focus on it a lot.
They call Hollywood soft power. Everything that happens in America, it goes global within minutes.
exactly, and especially Trump himself. He's more of he's like a personality, you know, a TV personality even. And but it's not just politicians and politics. I would say the media plays a large part of it too. It's a vicious circle, really, because the politicians and the media, they they'll create this fear and uncertainty and doubt and give voice to it, which resonates with bigots and triggers them, and it might even turn those that are ignorant or naive on the subject into bigots, and then those people will speak out, or worse, act out on whatever they believe and on that sentiment, and that creates like this air of entitlement that the media and the politicians can continue doing what they're doing, and that it normalizes the behavior. And
it's a nice feeling, isn't it, when you all huddle together and you create a fear of the other. It makes you feel nice and cozy sometimes. I don't know if that's the right word.
It's probably a mix of misery loving company and the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Who knows? But I wanted to touch on one point that Dr. Chris made earlier, which is how he mentioned the media now, they emphasize if someone's a terrorist, they'll emphasize that he was an Islamic terrorist, and I'd even take it a step further. I'd say that nowadays they don't even need to mention that they're Islamic. If they mention terrorist, it's most people will think, because the stereotype is so strong now, most people will think, well, they'll imagine a Muslim man, whereas if and they've talked about this in the media and stuff in the past, where if it's a non-Muslim doing the act, then it's just like a sole person not in his right state of mind, maybe like insane or something like that, a disturbed individual, but not really a terrorist per se, even though it's a terrorist act. But yeah, right now, like when the public hears, heck, even when I, as a Muslim, hear the word terrorist or extremist, I think of it like it's been ingrained.
Conclusion,
it's like I'll imagine a Muslim man more often than not. I have to actually work to imagine someone that's not
If I can bring
Muslim.
Dr. Chris back in there, Dr. Adam's talking about how the media has, played this bogeyman so well that even now, when they mention the word terrorist, automatically people are thinking Muslim.
Yeah, and absolutely, and you're absolutely right. I mean, I remember watching BBC News 24 when Anders Breivik did the terrorist attack in Norway, in Oslo and the island of Utøya, and the first round of reports were about it, and BBC News 24 had experts on, and they were saying, why would Al Qaeda wish to target Norway? And so it was really interesting. The first, so before they had any raw information, they already had somebody on there talking about why Al Qaeda, and it was hilarious in some ways, and obviously very dangerous in others. But it was hilarious because they said that that Norway had lent one plane or something to the Allied forces who would fight in the war on terror. So they'd narrowed down to this one thing, and then there was a statement that said that the perpetrator was Caucasian, and then the experts were saying, well, there's a lot of converts to Islam in Europe who have become radicalized, become more extreme, and then there was this whole thing that actually he was Norwegian and he was doing this against multiculturalism on the far right, and then the language changes completely and it becomes he's a lone wolf. And you're absolutely right.
He's
and
a
then
perpetrator, a lone gunman.
That's right. So it's like it's not part of a bigger thing. Whereas if you're Muslim, well, you're part of a much bigger thing. Like you're part of a bigger kind of ideology. That's informing this. If you're white and from the far right, you become an individual. You become a lone wolf. You have no kind of connections whatsoever, and absolutely right. With Breivik, what did they try and do? They tried to prove that he was insane. And Breivik, throughout the court case, said, I'm not.
He kept reading his manifesto.
And this, so you're absolutely right, and there's so many things. I mean, and I think that's one of the things with halal now, is the use of the word halal becomes a proxy. So you can talk about, I'm against halal meat, as a way of saying, actually, I hate Muslims. You know, so.
Dr. Chris, you want to say something about the global nature of things?
Yeah, well, we were just chatting about the kind of Canada, and one of the really interesting things is that, you know, via Rebel Media, which is a Canadian media platform, that's where people such as Tommy Robinson and Katie Hopkins have been actually using that as a platform to broadcast their anti-Muslim messages from, you know, to kind of not only to appeal to the UK, but also to appeal to North America. And so, you know, so again, you know, the book, the kind of idea, the kind of Islamophobic kind of, you know, ideology is very much something which is global. It takes a different form here, it takes a different form in Canada, but actually is pretty much the same problem.
We've been talking to Dr. Chris Allen, Associate Professor at the University of Leicester, about his new book titled Reconfiguring Islamophobia, a radical rethinking of a contested concept. Now, Dr. Chris, this book is available widely from your website?
From www.drchrisallen.uk. You can get in touch with me on Twitter, @drchrisallen, and you can get it on all good websites.
Okay.
Thanks
Sounds
so much
like
for inviting me
fantastic
on.
reading. Thank you very much
Thank
for
you very
joining
much.
us today.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Adam Murabit. Thank you for joining us
Thank you for having me.
all the way from Saskatoon, Canada.